This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. If you've ever been to a fan convention, you've probably seen many people dressed up as their favorite characters. Or maybe you even dressed up yourself. Some fans want to create accurate replications of characters, spending hours making sure costumes are just right. But steampunk, a subgenre of science fiction, is a little different. It's all about retro, futuristic technology and being as creative as possible. It's also not just about fashion. Today, we hear from the steampunk community here in Connecticut. But before we get to that, helping us answer the essential question, what the heck is steampunk, is the steampunk scholar himself. Mike Perschon is an English professor at MacEwan University in Alberta, Canada. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Catherine.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation. Let us know if you're into steampunk. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-9677. Or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Mike, I want to start with talking about, giving us a little background about steampunk. You know, how did you get interested in it, and how did you become a steampunk scholar is what I want to know.
I was doing my master's, and I was writing a paper on alternate history, and I came across this academic article on steampunk. It was literally the only one that had been written at the time. And then it came time for me to do my PhD, and they said, what do you want to do your thesis on? And the conversation led me to saying steampunk, because I got to thinking, like, if I have to write about something for 3 to 6 years, I want to have a good time with it.
That's a good call.
Steampunk seemed like it would be a good time. So that's how I got into it. The steampunk scholar thing was unintentional. I made a blog, and I like alliteration, and I wanted to signal that this was a blog for steampunk scholars.
Ah, gotcha.
And then I would go to cons, and people would introduce me as it. And so it stuck, and I'm okay with that.
Right. I mean, titles are given to you by others. That's how it works.
Yeah.
And that's really cool that you were able to do steampunk as your dissertation. I mean, not everyone can say that. And how very steampunk of you that it sort of happened by accident. So, through conversation, that's something you want to do. You want to have fun writing your thesis. So what attracted you to steampunk? What about the genre that you're like, I can do this for 5 years?
I loved Jules Verne as a kid.
Me too.
And the Disney vision of what Captain Nemo's submarine, the Nautilus, looked like was really captivating to me. I don't know how many people are even going to know what I mean when I say that I had the Viewmaster reels for that. There was these little slide things that you could project them onto a wall, or you could look at a viewer, and they'd had the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea one, and it was modeled off of the Disney vision. And so that look of that ship was a big part of when I was a kid, and it stuck in my imagination. And science fiction writer Greg Bear at a con I was at, he actually said that's where he thinks steampunk started, was Harper Goff's design of the Nautilus. So that was baked into my early memories, seeing some of the movies that were made of H.G. Wells novels, or ones that were just inspired by, like Edgar Rice Burroughs, or the stories of yesteryear. I liked that era. I liked the bolts and the brass and the rust. I liked the cravats. And once I got older, I understood. Like, I liked that finery, I guess.
Love a good cravat.
I like period dramas, so it all felt of a piece.
I personally am a big fan of Around the World in 80 Days, and I know that's classically it's neither sci-fi or fantasy, but it's Jules Verne is such a classic and I know a lot of people see him sort of as the godfather of steampunk, and I know this is a question that the answer will depend on who I'm asking this, but what are the origins of steampunk? Where did it all start, or where did the inspiration come from?
Well, definitely the inspiration comes down from Verne and H.G. Wells, but I think it comes via the films more than it does the literature. Really, the kickoff, as far as I'm concerned, for steampunk happens in the 1980s with some 3 American writers, K.W. Jeter, James Blaylock, and Tim Powers, and they were all living in California at the time. And Jeter had gotten a collection of books that were about the London poor and how they lived, and was fascinated by this and used it as research for some of his books. And near the end of the 80s, Locus magazine asked Jeter, this stuff that you and Blaylock and Powers are writing, what would you call it? Like if it's going to be the next big thing. And Jeter's a joker. He's always got this wry grin on his face. He knows a joke that nobody else in the room does. And what he wrote back to Locus was, I think it will be the next big thing, and I don't know, let's call it steampunk. But it was an offhand remark, and he's gone on the record saying that. He was like, I wasn't starting a genre or even a subgenre. But that term caught. It was meaningless. I tend to think to some degree it still lacks any sort of powerful meaning, but it sounds fun. Like it sounds like something that could be really enjoyable. And so, and I think of it too as like a blast pattern, as opposed to like, this is where it starts and that's it. Because if you go backwards from that just a little bit, you're looking at other writers playing in the Victorian era, but you're also looking at the television series Wild Wild West. So it's not that there wasn't any of that sort of thing going on, but I think we get the beginnings of what we now call steampunk at that point.
Well, I find the historical background super fascinating, which is also it makes sense for something like steampunk to have all of those elements into one subgenre, say, and then now we're calling all kinds of different alternate genres within that, like cyberpunk and splatterpunk and all of that. And so, but I think for a lot of us, when we hear the word steampunk, perhaps we first think of the Victorian era, like you mentioned earlier, especially the Victorian slums. That's a really popular place to get inspiration from. So can you talk about, like, in terms of being a fan of steampunk, or if you're cosplaying steampunk style, how is it different from just dressing up like a Victorian, or, quote, quote, just being a fan of sci-fi?
Well, earlier when you were talking about going to a con and you said, people like to dress up for those things, there's a benchmark for someone to recognize whether you're Spider-Man, right?
Right.
They'll know immediately. Steampunk doesn't have anything that's so canonical that you dress up in it and somebody immediately recognizes you, with maybe the exception of someone like Sherlock Holmes. Like if you're dressed up as Holmes, then in that classic costume, then somebody's likely going to recognize you. But the difference between just dressing up Victorian, say for a historical recreation society, or just, because you're at a really cool party or that's the way you like to dress, is that steampunk messes with history. That is like the tightest definition I could ever come up with. It is that it messes with that period in history, mostly in technological ways. So that's why you see people who have cogs on a top hat or on a corset. Even the corset being worn outside is not historically accurate, but historical accuracy doesn't matter to steampunks. Most steampunks that I've met who work like that, who make stuff, or who cosplay or do fashion, they want to play with these vintage eras like they're a toy box. I could say toolbox, but it's more playful than that. Because so often when someone would explain to me the fashion that they'd put together, there's no practical application for the stuff that they've made. It's just, there's a lot of beauty. There are the occasional practical things, but more often than not, it's like, why do you have cogs on your dress? Why the goggles?
Right.
Why does everybody need to have goggles? They don't. They just look cool.
Right. And that's kind of nice sometimes. You don't have to explain why the aesthetics are cool.
Well, every other area of fashion, it's because it looks cool. And then we get to steampunk and like, what does it mean? I don't know that it means anything.
What does it mean? Right. And I guess that, because the creativity, the range of creativity, I think, is the beauty of steampunk too. And so I guess the question here, I think I already know the answer to this, but it doesn't have to be Victorian or simply vintage, right? It could be a dress from the 20s or the 40s or the 50s. Yeah?
Yeah. And there are people who are, there's if some steampunks are listening right now, they're like, no, it needs to be Victorian. And there is a
Right.
major romance publisher that flat out told their writers if they were writing steampunk, it had to be set in the Victorian period, which is it's really ethnocentric. It's very colonial. It assumes that nowhere else in the world was anybody having an industrial revolution and that everybody's industrial revolution happened at the same time. I went to a steampunk con in Sweden, and they refer to that period as Oscarian because that's who their king was at the time. I have a friend who her background is Vietnamese. And what's fascinating about her steampunk costume is that it's scandalous
Mm.
by way of comparison. Like for what would have been authentically Victorian, what she wears is scandalous because it shows a lot of leg. It's leg sheathed in a legging, but it's leg nonetheless. And so these ideas of like what constitutes perfect steampunk cosplay get like they get complicated when we look outside the boundaries of Victoriana. And if we're going to include the Wild West as like either the TV show or just the idea, the myth of the American West as a part of steampunk, that's not Victorian,
Right.
right? We really can't call the Wild Wild West Victorian. That would be broken in so many ways. So there's a lot of room to play and to run with this stuff. And then when you said, like, could I dress up as, somebody from the 20s? And some steampunks would say no, because even if it's not Victorian, it's 19th century. And I'm like, no, I'm sorry. So long as you have rigid airships, which didn't become a thing until the 20s, then you have to allow that people are going to push the boundaries of what vintage elements they're going to grab from. Um, and that's why I think of it as that toy box thing. And it was why
Right.
I was also really like, people came up with the term diesel punk. And so I'll be having a conversation with someone, they'll go, well, I really think that's more diesel punk. And I'm like, nobody says that word except for you and me.
Well, we're gonna
So
have to roll that
until it's
into.
popular enough to be in the public imagination, people are going to point to what might be diesel punk
Okay.
and say that's steampunk.
Okay. So we'll start that here too.
Okay, yeah.
We'll add
It's a
that.
broadly vintage look, though.
Got
That's
it.
the way that I would think of it.
Well, and I like that you mentioned airships because I was thinking about airships literally in my brain as I'm thinking about asking you to talk about the technology part of steampunk and the focus on steam energy. Why is that so much a part of this genre?
Because of the roots of it does start in the Victorian period. Like that's where Jeter and Powers and Blaylock were writing. Because of Charles Dickens, Sherlock Holmes, etc. We're reaching back to those times because we've seen a ton of movies about them or read a ton of books about them. Um, but the tech becomes essential because of that relationship to the industrial era. Now, what's fascinating, Catherine, is that there are so few steampunk novels in particular,
Hmm.
and even shows really that use steam
Right.
as the actual technology. Like, um, mostly they come up with fictional substances that can power um, an engine cleanly because there's nothing clean about using coal and producing steam. And steampunks often are really big on clean energy, and so they're like, "Oh, we'll just go up with this imaginary thing like H.G. Wells's Cavorite or whatever to make things fly or to make them do things that they need to narratively for it to be exciting." Because there's not very much. It's not really exciting to be on a steam train. It can't veer off the tracks. I shouldn't say it's not exciting. It can be, obviously.
Right.
But like airships are really bulky. They don't fly like the Millennium Falcon, but that's what you want if you want it, high adventure. And so they'll come up with these fictional substances or these advances we were never able to do to justify unlimited power. Like there's an anime called Steam Boy, and they basically get steam compressed to a level where it has effectively nuclear power, and that's ridiculous. So it's fiction. It's pure fiction at that point. It's not even really science fiction. It's actually a lot closer to fantasy.
Well, and I see a lot of people describe it as mad science. really, when it
Yes,
comes. And,
absolutely.
well,
The Universal horror movies, the mad scientist in his lab with all the Erlenmeyer flasks and whatnot, that's definitely an inspiration for steampunk.
oh, and before we go to break, I do want to ask because you mentioned clean energy, and I'm curious if environmental consciousness is a theme of steampunk as well, steampunk at all, because there's a lot of industrialization as part of the inspiration for steampunk. But is it a part of it? Is it a part of the theme, environmental consciousness?
It's so funny, Catherine, like any question you ask about steampunk, the answer is going to be it depends on the steampunk you talk to. There's not a lot of steampunk fiction that deals with environmental issues. That isn't the bigger social concern that most steampunk writers, at least the ones that I've read, play with. It's there, but it's not pervasive.
Well, I guess it follows the theme of we're here to have a good time.
There's a little bit of that, but
Yeah.
the social concerns of the steampunk scene were far more about gender and race, I
Mm.
found, than environmental ones. But that could be shifting.
Right. And we'll be continue this super, super interesting conversation with Mike Perschon, who's a steampunk scholar and English professor at MacEwan University in Canada. He'll be staying with us. And coming up next, we'll hear from the steampunk community from here in Connecticut. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Steampunk is a lot of things. It's a fashion statement, a genre, music, and throughout it all, a community. And joining us now from the Connecticut steampunk community is Bridget Rodriguez. She's a Steamposh admin and steampunk event coordinator. Bridget, welcome to Where We Live today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And still with us is Mike Perschon. He's a steampunk scholar and English professor at MacEwan University in Alberta, Canada. And for our listeners, you can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Bridget, you've been following on the conversation that I've been having with Mike earlier about what exactly is steampunk. So I want to pose the same question to you, too. What is steampunk for you, Bridget?
That is a good question. To me, it's just, Mike really put it well, but it's all inclusive. You really can do anything. Whereas, other things like we were talking about, Comic-Cons and stuff where you really need to get the character right, or going to historical reenactments where you need to make sure your materials are period accurate. There's just a lot of rules, even in Renaissance fairs. But steampunk allows you to just use your creativity, use your imagination, and anything's possible.
And how did you get interested in steampunk?
Well, I've always loved the Victorian aesthetic. I've always loved history. Uh, so it's just been something that kind of I've always done, and didn't really have a word for it until actually I watched the show Steampunked on HGTV. They brought all these steampunk makers in to a show, and they each had to do over a room. And when I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's the word for what I do.
Oh, I love that. I've never heard of that. I'm going to have to put that on my list.
Yeah. I think you can still watch it on Discovery Plus.
Well, I actually stayed at a literature-themed bed and breakfast in Portland, Oregon, many moons ago, and the room that I stayed in actually happened to be a Jules Verne themed, and they basically decorated into like the Nautilus. So it was pretty cool. Like tentacles
Oh,
were
wow.
coming out of the walls. It'd be creepy if you weren't a fan, but I was a fan, so it worked out for it worked out for me. Did not get nightmares. Thank you very much. And Bridget, Mike mentioned this earlier too. It's a very all-inclusive fandom. Steampunk is, and there are no rules essentially. But can you also talk about, how is steampunk different from other fandoms? Are there points that you can, point out that it's very different from others?
Um, I think it just becomes where you can take your idea and a character and make it your own, but it's still going to be recognizable as steampunk because, most people do think of it as Victorian. You start with a corset or, a top hat, add the goggles. So I think a lot of times you can still recognize it, but it is something that you just, you know, you're not looking to create a necessarily recognizable character. Um, I think that's what makes it different from a lot of the other genres out there.
And Mike, especially with what Bridget just said and with what you mentioned earlier too, we think about the Victorian narrative, it's usually pretty focused on white voices. But as we've been talking about, steampunk is a lot more inclusive, it sounds like, compared to other genres. So can you talk about internationally? What does this look like? I know you mentioned anime earlier too, so this is very expansive.
Yeah. I mean, if you go down the anime rabbit hole, you end up finding out that uh, Hayao Miyazaki beat Jeter and Powers and Blaylock to, I think, really bringing steampunk to a wider audience at the time in Japan with Castle in the Sky. Um, and a lot of Miyazaki's films have that sort of aesthetic to them. But there's a whole there's a whole vibe in Japan where I don't speak Japanese, so I could not tell you the actual Japanese phrase, but it translates to the Paris of our dreams. And it's the sort of quasi Europe that you'll see in a lot of anime and manga, that doesn't represent earlier periods in Japan, but rather looks like earlier periods in Europe. And so you've got that right there. That, like, is steampunk just Victorian? No, because we're moving even outside Britain in Japanese visions of it. But when you get something like, there's an anime series called Cabaneri of the Iron Fortress, and it's very steampunk. It's got a very steampunk train, but then the rest of the aesthetic is traditional Japanese clothing, culture, etc. Steampunk's really big in South America. As I said earlier, I have a friend who did it using her own heritage, her Vietnamese heritage. Nissi Shaw, a science fiction writer from the States, from where y'all are from, has written a book called Everfair, where they imagine the Congo, reimagine the Congo in an alternate steampunk vision. So once you start playing outside of the Victorian toolbox, you see there's a lot of other expressions of it. But Bridget's absolutely right that, I mean, when people think of steampunk, they're going to associate it most frequently with the Victorian. But people are like, because of that creativity that Bridget talked about, there is that urge to push at the edges, and there's nobody telling you that you can't.
Right. And Bridget, with what Mike just said too, and how wide range the creativity, I mean, there's really no limits here when we're talking about steampunk. So when you're dressing up and going to events, Bridget, are you seeing a flexibility in steampunk in terms of how you create a character or the characters that you're seeing at these events?
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing the different things that you get to see. Um, there are, we try different events that we create. We'll take all different kinds of themes in order to see what people come up with. We're planning a Beetlejuice themed event because the second movie's coming out in September. And we'll see what people come up with different things from Beetlejuice, pulling those elements in. For steampunk, we are doing a bathing beauties event where we want to get people dressed in Victorian bathing suits.
Can you describe what that looks like?
Well, we're thinking, so the thing about steampunks is I find that their interests are all over. And we had actually done a pool party for one of the events, and people were dressed in Victorian bathing suits, basically the stripes, for ladies it was almost a long dress with um, undergarments and everything to go swimming. So we thought it would be a fun thing to do to go to the beach during the summer and all dress in Victorian or bathing suits that definitely don't fit the norm today.
Right. And when obviously there's no typical costume, but can you talk about how do you put together a costume, especially for someone who may want to start and they don't know where to start? How do you usually go about doing this?
I'm more of a pull together different pieces from different elements, different places. There's a lot of stuff you can get on Amazon. You can get stuff. I definitely, you guys were talking about social, for environmentally conscious. One of the things about steampunks that I have met is that it's a lot of recycle, reuse, um, finding some piece of an outfit or to make some sort of mechanism is a lot of, going to flea markets or
Yeah.
um, to different, we actually go to the Connecticut steam mechanical museum over in Kent, Connecticut. They have a plethora of different gadgets and items and all these different things. And, people will make stuff from all those different, little pieces of old machines that they just have lying around. Um, but yeah, I mean, actually, later today, I'm working on my outfit for tomorrow, which is a kind of Christmas, a holiday photo shoot at Gillette Castle. I'm putting together, I have a skirt that I have purchased, but I'm adding a curtain. I took a curtain that I found at Savers and I'm making it be the front piece because the skirt itself is plain in the front but has a very fancy bustle, and I wanted it to be a little bit more. And curtains make great bustles or overskirts.
Who knew? You're gonna have to send us some photos because that sounds amazing.
Yeah. It's just sheets and curtains and other things like that already have parts sewn into them for adding it on. It's just a lot easier than, if you don't sew, um, to make outfits. And a lot of, inspiration I find online, if you Google how to make a bustle, no sew bustle, there's lots of tutorials. And that's pretty much what we do. And we get together, we talk, about different things that we've done in the past and what things have worked. My very first steampunk outfit, I took an old vest I owned and just took in some ribbon and safety pins and made it look like a corset
That
just
sounds
by
amazing.
doing that. It was just, but that was my first foray into it
Right.
years ago. Um,
Well, and Bridget, you mentioned this is like a Christmas themed party. And Mike, I want to pick
mhm.
your brain here. Are holidays a theme for steampunk?
Uh, Not in the fiction. There's there are very few instances where people in steampunk novels celebrate Christmas. And it's funny because of like how hugely influential Dickens is for the genre itself. Just the like, if you just looked at the fashion side of things, the cosplay side of things, you see tons of people dressing up as Artful Dodgers and characters, these waifs, these we have these ideas of the factory children and whatnot that certainly have gotten worked with in steampunk costume, but you don't see a ton of straight up, here's my Christmas steampunk thing, with the exception of Justin Bieber.
I did not expect that.
Yeah, Justin Bieber did a cover of Santa Claus is Coming to Town, and the video for it it's steampunk.
Oh, I see. Well, we're gonna need to head off to a break pretty soon, but I want to ask you both a final question. I'll go with you first, Bridget. Can we talk about, what do you think is the purpose of steampunk, and what do you hope it, or what do you think it seeks to inspire?
For me, and the group that we have together is to one, get together, have fun, to dress in amazing, fantastical costumes, outfits that you don't get to wear every day. And just to be able to take our creativity and put it out there. And, we love going out to, we'll go to our event all dressed up, but we love going out after to eat as a group and having people be like, oh, wow, what are you dressed up for?
It's just my everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen, people who really just dress this way all the time. A little less maybe at work, not as much jewelry or the hat every day, but sure. There's their Victorian blouses and vests, and that's just the way that they dress. But for those of us, we just, every weekend we want to get out there and dress up and you just have fun.
And Mike, really quickly here, what's the purpose of steampunk for you?
There's a guy who runs the UK, the biggest steampunk con in the UK, called Asylum. And he used to say steampunk for him was about being splendid. That was their theme, be splendid. And I think that's what Bridget was just talking about, that there's something about seeing people in steampunk costumes, whether they're posh or whether they're, sort of doing the poor thing, the punk thing, that has a joy to it, a creative joy to it. I once said that I think steampunk is like, a Victorian teacup. You can put anything you want in it. So if you want it to be meaningful, put something meaningful in it. If you just want it to be fun, have fun.
Well, we appreciate you both for being very splendid this morning on Where We Live. Thank you to Mike Perschon, who's a steampunk scholar and English professor at MacEwan University in Alberta, Canada, and Bridget Rodriguez. She's a steampunk posh admin and steampunk event coordinator. Thank you both so much for being on Where We Live today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you want to learn more about steampunk and how you can get involved with the steampunk community here in Connecticut, visit ctpublic.org/where we live and check out today's show post. And coming up next, we're pivoting to talk about a favorite topic here on Where We Live, birds. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Each year, the Connecticut Audubon Society publishes its annual State of the Birds to give the public an update on the bird population in our state. Last year, the report showed a staggering population decline, and this year, it details some new technology solutions to protect the birds. And joining us now is Tom Anderson. He is the Director of Communications for the Connecticut Audubon Society and the editor of Connecticut State of the Birds. Welcome back to the show, Tom.
Thank you, Catherine. Nice to be here.
And for our listeners, you can join the conversation too, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Tom, you got to tell us about this year's State of the Birds. I think this year's report seems to be a bit more solution-oriented on what we can actually do to protect the bird population in our state.
Yeah, so what we did this year was we looked back at previous reports, and this year is the 18th. The first one was 2006, and we found issues or studies that we had written about that we thought needed updating because, well, as the subtitle of this year's report says, new knowledge and better technologies are changing conservation. And so we picked 5 areas that we thought had changed significantly enough to update.
And can you talk about some of those solutions to prevent bird building collisions, which seems to
Sure,
be
yeah.
sort of the major thing?
One of the real big problems is in birds in North America and in Connecticut is that each year 1 billion birds die when they crash into buildings. I know it sounds like a huge number, and it is. It crashes into buildings is the second largest cause of bird deaths. And one of the reasons that happens is because birds migrate at night and they're attracted to building lights. The state enacted a law this year that requires exterior lights to be turned off from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. on all state buildings. So that's a start. The other reason is that in general, birds can't see or recognize glass. They see the reflection of whatever the glass happens to be facing. It's basically an optical illusion of habitat and open sky. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of birds die each year when they fly into buildings. Research shows that houses and buildings that are 1 to 3 stories tall account for 44% of all deadly bird collisions, and buildings of 4 to 11 stories tall account for 56% of deadly bird collisions. And I should probably interject now that this was a story that I edited, but it was written by a woman named Viveka Morris, and she's a clinical lecturer and a research scholar at Yale Law School, and she's also the founder of something they call the Yale Bird Friendly Building Initiative.
And you mentioned like there's a lot taller buildings that birds can fly into, but are there things that people, in residential areas that are there things that we can do to stop that? Because I have witnessed, birds flying into like friends' houses, buildings, and it's only 1 story.
Sure, and that's one of the things we updated in this year's report. When we first wrote about this back in 2007, there wasn't a whole lot that could be done. Research was being done, but there were no really effective solutions. But there's been a huge amount of work. There's now something that is something called fritted glass, which is basically, as I understand it, it's glass made with tiny, tiny particles of other glass ground up in it, and it makes it visible for birds. They don't see the reflection. They see an object that they shouldn't fly into. I don't know if the place that I've seen this used most recently is a brand new 2-story library in New Canaan, where all of the windows, and there are big plate glass windows, are fritted glass. You can also use glass with ultraviolet patterns. Old-fashioned louvers and insect window screens work perfectly well. If you keep your screens up, birds don't fly into them. Frosted glass, stained glass, photovoltaic glass, they've all been proven to work to keep birds away from flying into them. New York City, a couple of years ago, 2019, I think, passed a law which requires all new construction and significant renovations to use bird-friendly materials. And one of the things we're working on this year and next year is to start progress towards a similar law in Connecticut.
And we've got about 2 minutes left here, but I still want to get to the report that looked at urban forestry. So can you talk about that and how it's, you can get better data about the birds in urban forests as you develop this?
Yeah, sure. So Danica Dorosky, who is the Connecticut State Urban Forester, she did her PhD work at the Yale School of the Environment, studying urban forests in New Haven, and she studied about 24 places, including big parks like Edgewood and East Rock, but also tiny places that were basically vacant lots. And what she found is that while vacant lots can typically be considered to be an eyesore or a sign of neglect, in fact, they are developing into small, full-fledged forests that are important to all kinds of wildlife, including birds. But when we looked at it, we found that not many of these at all had been studied for the bird community had not looked at many of them. Bird watchers tend to go to much bigger places. And we know that cities are really important for birds, especially during migration. When they land after migrating, they need places to eat and rest. And so one of the things we call for in this report is that more attention be paid by the birding community in Connecticut to these small urban forests, which all of Connecticut cities have, and which we really don't have a good sense of what their importance are for wildlife and for birds.
And in about 20 seconds, can you tell us where can listeners learn more about the state of the birds?
Yeah, sure. ctaudubon.org/bird report. That's where you can download a PDF of this report, ctaudubon.org/bird report.
We've been listening to Tom Anderson, who's the Director of Communications for the Connecticut Audubon Society and editor of the Connecticut State of the Birds. Thank you so much for being on the show, Tom.
You're welcome.
Listeners can also find a link on our website to the State of the Birds report on ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you always for listening.